Good evening and welcome to Inside the Rookery Season 8, Episode 15, where I am very happy to be joined by Ben Thompson, 25-year veteran of the games industry, accomplished illustrator and art director from a number of things which we will hear about from Ben in a minute. So welcome to the stream, Ben, and welcome to my fellow Rook Mark, who's here to grill Ben on all things artistic.
God help us all.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
No
I'm
problem
humbled
at all.
to be here.
Thank you. Here is Ben's website if you want to go and have a peek at it. As always, we've had loads of questions pre-submitted by patrons on our friendly Discord community, and we will also be taking questions and comments like this one. His work looks very cool. Live from the chat. So if you have any questions, please do pop them in the chat and I will bring them up as always. Before we get into the pre-submitted questions, I will hand over to Ben to introduce himself to us all.
Well, hello, gang. Thank you for having me. Great to meet everybody virtually here. My name is Ben Thompson, as said. From a history background of everything from illustration to art direction to creative direction. It didn't start that way. I got in from art school, from a long interest in art all the way from childhood, drawing beheadings in, the margins of church, rectories and such. I had very patient parents. They saw me through all of that, and I ended up attending art school here in California. And after that, was bound and determined to illustrate book covers and album covers, wherever may have seen my work. Ended up finding my way into Magic the Gathering while in school, actually, when I substituted it for some school assignments where I could. From there to Dungeons and Dragons and a number of other things that Wizards of the Coast was responsible for. Went over from there to be basically teaching. I was a professor of art at two different local universities here in California, Cal State Long Beach and Mount San Antonio College, for anybody who might have heard or seen of them. From there, would go on to work at my first video game studio, Sigil Games Online, where I was on Vanguard Saga of Heroes with Keith Parkinson of TSR and Dungeons and Dragons lore. From there, would go on to Upper Deck Entertainment, decidedly not the sports side. It was very much like a school without, the lockers in much of the ways there, where I was working on World of Warcraft trading card game in the physical sense. From there, would find my way over to Blizzard Entertainment, where I would join the Team 5, which would be known later as the Hearthstone team. Was probably, I think, the fifth one to join that team, and would go on to work there for just shy of a decade, just over a decade, actually. And then most recently Moonshot Games, over here in California as well. Have yet to paint that book cover, have yet to paint that album cover, but one day we'll find our way there. I've been distracted fully over the last decade and a half or two with video games. So
I can, on our advert, the picture of you're playing a guitar. So is that what led to your interest in illustrating album covers? Your music?
I have always been a music fan. I've joked, but only half jokingly, that if it wasn't art, I'd find my way in doing something with music, one way, shape, or form, be it performing or production or anything of the like. So it was one of those. It was like a plan B. A career would have been in music had art not taken off.
I did ask Ben. I said, because we need a photo to go in the ad, and I did say to Ben, please find a picture that's something not too sexy, but he couldn't help himself.
Yeah, well, they are. It's decidedly the least sexiest and the most rock and roll.
So when did you meet Ben working together at Blizzard?
Yeah, well, no, our paths are actually our swords first crossed when Ben was art director at Upper Deck, and I was at Blizzard on World of Warcraft, and a lot of the artists there were doing cards for the physical World of Warcraft trading games, nice little income supplement. And Ben was art directing the cards that I was doing. And there was one particular card that I submitted that Ben thought I was a little heavy-handed in the use of, I think it was the perspective tool in Photoshop. And I'd taken a piece of art and just crudely tweak the perspective to make it look more dramatic. And the trouble with that is if you just use it like a caveman, you end up with creating like a weird billboard, and it flattens all the depth. And Ben rightly called me on my bullshit. And I was like, well, I made a couple of adjustments, and then he said, no. And I said, well, if you don't like it, you just pay me the kill fee. I don't care whether you use it or not. And Ben called my bluff. So he said, all right, we'll only pay you half the money, and we're going to use it. And I think at that point, a friendship for the ages was forged. We've been great mates ever since.
Was confident this story was going to get told at some point. I was glad it was in the first 5 minutes.
That's amazing. And you worked on Magic the Gathering, and we are going to give a little shout out. So in the background, we've got a Ralph Horsley original from Warhammer 4th edition, but you've worked closely with Ralph on Magic the Gathering, and Ralph has done so many cards for that game. So a big shout out to a friend of the Rookery, Ralph, while we're on this stream too. So let us get into the questions. So Zoltan the Golden Raven, who is not with us tonight because he cannot, but he promised me he'll watch on replay and has submitted loads of questions. So thank you, Zoltan, has asked, how closely do you work with game designers during the art creation process, and how did their needs influence your direction?
I mean, it's never zero, which is to say it depends on the game to some extent how much the game design influences the art and vice versa. If we take a game like Hearthstone, it's a very art-driven game. It's a very user interface-driven game, and the art that's inherent in that. So there's a lot of back and forth, which is to say very, very regularly, a lot of conversation about how things are communicated visibly within the play field of something like Hearthstone. If it's, another game of another sort, then certainly it's going to be influential to always keep your game designers in the loop and ask them to do the same, and to invite the critiques and questions that end up coming from both sides of that field. I would think that extends beyond even game designers. I think that developers in general have an inherent interest in what each other are doing, if they're doing it right in making a game, and that you will oftentimes get your most, I would say, meaningful feedback, or even most common feedback, from people not in the art side of things. So if they're a designer or they're an engineer or even just a player, QA or otherwise, you will get a lot of meaningful feedback there that inherently looks and sounds a lot like the kind of feedback you'll get from your player base, because they are, they're just players of the game, and they love the industry, and they love the work that you're doing. So always keep an ear open for the kind of feedback that you end up getting from all those groups.
Kadane in the chat has called out, what a fun military collection on Ben's wall. We might get into that later. You never know.
Sure. Dive in.
And here is actually a question from Kadane. So if a project has multiple artists, do you think you get a better game if you get them to work to a house style for consistency, or each to express their individuality?
Well, sort of, again, the non-answer, but the answer is it depends on the game. And I'll make a good example of both, which is to say, let's start with Hearthstone again, or you can look at your World of Warcrafts or your Overwatches or the like. Very, very much influenced by a house style, right? There's even some lightly held rules or heavily held rules in terms of what the visual world looks like there and what you need to kind of stay consistent with. And it's through that consistency that the game feels cohesive and feels like it came from the same place, and it came from, in that case, a Blizzard. Or if you were looking at, another game, Dungeons and Dragons has a little bit of a lighter hand on that. Or even, I would say, Magic the Gathering is a great example of a very light hand on that, which is to say, you look at a Wayne Reynolds, or you look at a Ralph Horsley, or you look at, a Steve Prescott or Todd Lockwood. You see the artist first in those pieces, then you see what they're actually creating that stays consistent with the game. But they very, very much are about celebrating the individual styles of the artists themselves. So that's a game that I think benefits from having a wide variety of individuality within the art that you see there. So it depends on the game that you're making, and it depends on the group that is making that game and what their inherent goals are for it.
Yeah, I've found I can see both sides of the argument. I think establishing from a company perspective, establishing a house style is great for the brand, but I do miss sometimes that sort of diversity of interpretation. I mean, for me, certainly with Games Workshop over the years, when I was working back there in the late 80s and early 90s, the wide breadth of artistic style was very much kind of part of the appeal for me. You know, you get art from John Blanche or art from Wayne England or myself, very, very different styles, but it all together, you've got, oh, this is Warhammer, this is the whole vibe. Yeah. These days, it's far more consistent. There's far more an established style, which I recognize as a useful tool in terms of brand identity. But I do miss that sort of that diversity of artistic interpretation. But I get it. Yeah, I understand why there's been a drive towards it.
I think there's moments where you can make that determination too within a company or within a greater corporation or the like. We ran into that in Hearthstone at the very beginning, which is to say there was a house style, is a house style for Blizzard and World of Warcraft specifically. But in designing Hearthstone from day one, we knew we didn't want the exact look of a World of Warcraft or even Warcraft 3 or 2 or the RTS style. We wanted a style that was inherently Hearthstone driven. And we set up a very specific set of guideposts or values for that from an art perspective going in. And I would say the buy-in wasn't 100% when we started that pitch, to the company at a greater length and had discussions about it. And it evolved over time, but it very much became a much more lighthearted, simplified, even whimsical look and feel to Hearthstone than you ever get in Warcraft proper.
Yeah, I remember that when going from having done art for the WoW trading card game and then doing stuff later for Hearthstone and getting feedback that, oh, can you up the saturation here? Can you take out some of the detail? What less detail? Lots of sort of areas of smooth, flat, vibrant color. Like, oh, okay, yeah, and you kind of, once you wrap your head around that, it's easy to make that adjustment. But yeah, establishing that look and feel.
And that was supported to some extent by the sound design on Hearthstone. That was quite whimsical compared to,
for sure,
like it went along with the style of the cards, I felt.
Totally. I mean, I would say that the very, very first inception for a more lighthearted, a more simplified, broader approach came first and foremost. Well, I can't even say that properly. I would say art, but also it was, again, back to that original question. It was art and design talking together about where do we shine? How do we shine here and show us something different, but still very, very familiar? And there came an alignment behind if we're taking something that's very complex, your typical TCG, and simplifying it in a way, not dumbing it down, but simplifying it in a way that is more approachable and more at ease, then the art should follow suit. We wanted something that was inviting and felt more simplified and easier to get into for basically a genre of game that is complex on its face, no matter what you do. And the deeper you get into it, the more complex TCGs typically are. So we wanted something with that over-the-shoulder appeal visually, and we wanted something simplified from a gameplay, and these things work together to then inform the VFX, the audio, everything that followed.
Mm-hmm. And it was an easy game to get into, I can confirm that. As viewers of Lawhammer last night will know, my children may consider Hearthstone a third parent for a period of their life, because I played it so much.
There you go.
Yeah, we speculated on Lawhammer last night that they're both studying games design in an effort to understand what made their mothers so
abandon them.
And replicate that for monetary purposes.
Sorry, kids.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry if you're watching interns. Zoltan, we were just talking about you, Zoltan, and you have arrived, so good evening. 101 Colonel said, I never got into World of Warcraft itself, but I certainly, thanks, mother, more big sister, lol. You'd be surprised at the number of people that I remember on a bus recently. The driver said to Josie, don't worry, I'm going to wait for your sister, which I was quite pleased about. Less so. So following on from the question above, I've reordered them, so who knows what the question above was, John Pick, but thank you. Have you ever received a piece of art that was wrong for the brief, but was so good you had to find somewhere to use it?
Absolutely. I think that happens in just about any, I would say TCGs tends to happen a lot. So you got your, Magic the Gathering, you definitely in Hearthstone, and even in the World of Warcraft TCG, we saw that quite a bit. That definitely happens on a regular basis. And if you're doing the job, what I would call correctly, you don't just throw it away because it didn't follow the art brief in front of you, but rather if there is a place that definitely could benefit from this. And sometimes even the art itself has devised ways to change what the card does, because it kind of it gets those gears turning in game design and goes, oh, that would be so much cooler. Oh, that would definitely fit this art even better. But to the point of this question, there's definitely been pieces that I've set aside for, not going to work for this one, probably may have to ask for a revision, or in some cases, the card itself gets cut, which is to say during the process of game design, cards get cut frequently throughout the process, and it just doesn't fit with that mechanic anymore, or that class, or whatever it may be. And it tends to go on a pile for possibly a future card design, and the art that was associated with it the same as well. There's been pieces that I've gotten in sketch form and basically said, definitely take it to final. I've let the artist know we're unlikely to be able to use it for this one per se, but I think this will be really great if we can end up using it over here. And even if it doesn't take any adjustment or minor adjustments to get it there, it's always worth having a backlog of art to pull from, for sure. And those pieces will often find themselves there. There's even been cases of like a piece of art that goes out and takes a while to come back. There's been some artists that take a little bit longer. They miss their deadline on that thing. We know it's going to be a great piece. Typically, I'll pull in another piece for that card per se, and then a year later, I make the piece of art that was wonderful and needs to go on a card. So we'll find a home for it then as well. So it's a little bit of a controlled chaos sometimes in terms of how this stuff gets applied.
And you mentioned in your introduction that you've been a teacher. So Zoltan has asked, how do you approach giving feedback to artists to ensure the final piece aligns with the brief while still encouraging creative freedom? And I'm also curious in that feedback side of things, how much giving feedback to your students is similar to giving feedback to people who work for you? Like, how much have you got from each direction?
There's several good questions kind of all in there.
All wrapped up together.
I would say, no, it's totally fine. Let's start with this one, which is to say it starts even earlier than the feedback when it comes to encouraging creative freedom. And what I mean by that is the description for the art needed. I try to keep as loose and as non-wordy as possible, right? Because I've been on the other side of this where I'm getting art descriptions that allow for that creative freedom and very much fetter that creative freedom. Which is to say it's, 5 sentences long or even 10 sentences long, and features things like, make sure we see the person with the sword in their left hand, and they're wearing a glove on that hand, and that glove is yellow, but we have to make sure that we see the 4 gems in their pocket, and you're like, what is this description? And that's actually not a fake description. That was a description that I was given on D&D back in the day. And it's like, you've got to be kidding me. Like, how are we going to execute on this? Whereas when you get that right description, it's a sentence, maybe 2, that sends you in the right direction, but allows for the delightful surprise that follows. And for all of us, the artist in question, as well as the art direction and the team itself, where we're definitely going to get what is needed, but be able to be surprised by that's even cooler. Oh, look at how they went there. I always try to leave room for that surprise beyond the art description itself, as when talking with the artist or building that relationship with the artist, invite them to, especially if they understand the game they're making the artwork for, invite them to the discussion about what that card does or what that mechanic does. And that may get their brain turning all the time for what an image would actually convey that better. The best example I have of this would be Matt Cavada. Matt Cavada is an illustrator for Magic the Gathering, and understood that game so well that would oftentimes get art descriptions that he's like, I already know what card this is going on. I know the mechanic this is probably meaning to show, and I think this is a better way to do it. And would do that all the time, and it was wonderful to get to see what would come from that. And I had the same experience with World of Warcraft trading card game, as well as Hearthstone and others. The more people understood, the more freedom I was able and excited to give them to be able to kind of explore those things themselves. So.
Yeah, it sounds like you're in a high trust culture if you've got a brief like that. The artist trusts you that you're going to give them a brief that's actually going to create, be what you want. But you also trust that the artist is going to be able to take a brief that's sparks their imagination. You've got confidence in their abilities, and they're going to deliver you something that you don't expect, but you still know will be good. Yeah.
Ideally speaking, that's how it ends
Ideally,
up working
like,
out.
in
Yeah,
an
and
ideal world. Yeah.
if you've got your Horsleys and you've got your Lockwoods and others, like these are not people that need 10-sentence descriptions. But if it's a new artist, and especially someone that's new to the industry as a whole as an artist, and not just to your usage or your IP, then sometimes a couple more do help. A couple more sentences, a little bit more direction, a little bit more me asking questions about where do they think they'll want to take this, or what is exciting about this to them, and kind of suss out where they may go with it. When it comes to actually giving the feedback to the artist, to the question itself, I always end up trying to cite things that are exciting about the piece in question. Certainly at the sketch phase, right? There's various phases that a piece goes through. It's rarely one and done. What are the things that are definitely exciting about it, and where they see that going? Ask them questions about kind of where do they think they're going to take this, in a place that I don't necessarily see it going. But rather than assume, just kind of ask, where are they planning on taking this, or what do they think their palette is, or ask, what's the focus within this piece? Where do we want, viewers kind of looking, and where they're taking it? And then based on those answers, kind of help guide them in the place it could go instead, or reinforce the places they may already be planning to go with it, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And if it sounds a little bit, I asked about your experience as a teacher. It sounds like if you're working with newer artists who are less experienced and earlier in their careers, that's where there would be more crossover between the kind of feedback you'd give as a teacher and the kind of feedback you'd give as an art director. You're highly unlikely to be giving your really experienced artists the same kind of feedback that you would as a teacher, I assume.
Probably not.
No,
Probably
not always. Not always.
Sometimes you're surprised. We get a different kind of delightful surprise in, oh, we don't know about that, or oh, you haven't heard about that. It varies, for sure, in terms of the kind of feedback that's being given. I tend to, sometimes somebody is a very storied artist or a very capable artist in a number of different venues, but this might be their first trading card game. Yeah. Or this might be their first piece for World of Warcraft, which happened a lot, right? I would get a lot of my fellow illustrators and friends working on Hearthstone for the first time, but they come from a D&D background, or they come from a Warhammer background, and they're very detailed and very minutia and very focused. And it's like, it's literally going to be this big. Like, we've got more things to focus on at a broader level than we do those little details that I myself love to over-render and dig into and really kind of delve into. So discussions about composition or even just shape read or value breakdown, come back, even with somebody 20, 30 years into their career.
Yeah, so it sounds like the answer to this question is almost certainly going to be yes. So Katena's asked, have you ever had to reject a wonderful piece of art because the artist has just not understood it had to work on something as small as a playing card?
I would say hopefully I had addressed this with the artist earlier, before I got to the point that I had to reject it. That's not to say that's always true. Thankfully, I think the number of times that happened was like single digit in terms of like how often I've had to reject it outright at the finished phase. That's costly for everybody. It's costly for the artist's time. It's costly for the budget, because you're still paying someone for a piece they finished, even though you may not use it, because that's the correct thing to do and contractually the thing you should do. And then ultimately it's kind of costly on the relationship, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's the artist themselves is saying, well, why didn't you tell me, or why didn't you guide me? That's my job as the art director to guide them. And it's also the illustrator's job to continue to ask questions to understand, that part of the process as a whole. So hopefully I haven't gotten to that point where I've had to reject a wonderful piece of art. It has happened, and I tend to try to use that as a jumping off point or a learning point with that artist to kind of, where did we fall short here? Where did I fall short? Where are some things I could have said or done earlier that would help to have understood this thing, and tend to ask questions from my perspective rather than, it's not a blame game. They may not have done anything wrong. I may have done things wrong along the part of the process too. So we just have a conversation and learn together over how to do it next time.
What I've been quite surprised about as a writer previously, I've usually only seen the finished product in the RPG games I've worked on. So I've seen, the final, or maybe like when Andy, my husband, was working as a producer, like the second from final, and he'd say, oh, look at this, Lindsay, like this is almost done. What do you think of it? What's been really surprising for me working with Mark is the differences between your initial sketches and then your like finished product. Like I kind of just assumed like the sketch would be not that detailed and your finished product would be like a much more detailed version of that sketch, but actually you make such interesting changes based on the discussions that we're all having as a team about those characters, and I've been really blown away by that. But also, like, what happens to those sketches? Like, what do you? They're also amazing. I'm like, Mark, I don't understand. Why are you saying that this one's finished and that wasn't? That one wasn't. They're all amazing. So, do you feel like sad for your little Robins that don't make it?
They tend to get. You're right. There's a lot of great points brought up in the course of all of that, which is to say, I love the initial phase of artwork as much as I love the finished phase. Not all artists are like that, but I think some of that comes from teaching as much as it does art direction, and how much value there is in that initial piece as there is in the finished piece. I used to try more to do the physical sketches myself in pencil or something of the like. I know Mark still does to a great extent, maybe more than I do at this point, because I do think there is such value in that kind of immediacy of something that is less, how do I put it, like less fixable, you know, even if it's in pencil, it's less fixable than it is in digital, where you could just quickly undo or quickly erase or whatever. I have notebooks full of the old sketches for Magic the Gathering and D&D pieces and things like that. They vary in looseness, but I am a very obsessive artist in some ways, where I love a lot of detail very early in the process, to the point that I would often do a lot of my sketches for Magic the Gathering at scale. Like,
wow.
Get out the mechanical pencil. Mark may not have seen these. I'll have sketchbooks full to show him next time he's over. But like literal card size illustrations with a mechanical pencil and eraser, where I've gone in and just done I would say block out, but sometimes folds and clothing and detail and everything to suit. And then what I'll end up doing with that is scanning it in or taking a picture of it and blowing it up, and then do all the fix it, you know, digitally to kind of get it cleaner. And then that little thumbnail remains, that stays very much in pencil and in a notebook somewhere. Digitally, that is less, you know, it's easier to lose them. I would say, digitally speaking, they end up finding their way into a folder and you forget about it. They become corrupted, God help us, you know, in files and backups. You move and
devices, like you get a new,
it happens. I've lost a couple very specific sketches that I wish I hadn't, because I would like to have taken those to final, or they, you know, they were for a personal piece of work or something like that.
So T-Blam, oh, sorry, Mark.
No, I was just going to say, just back what you said about the process and my sort of thumbnail sketches that you've really liked, and it's kind of I never really stopped to think about it until I started sharing that art with my teammates. Is that my quick sketches are far more cartoony, far more stylized than the finished illustrations. And I get that there's a sort of an appeal to those, because at that point, what I'm doing, if I'm drawing like almost like little sort of paper dolls to sort of work out the gear, the costume, the design of a character, and then once I've got that right and everybody else is on board and likes the design, then I'll go, okay, let's think about gesture and subtlety and shading and form and stuff. So they're sort of almost like two entirely different stylistic interpretations of the same character, but one rendered as like a sort of Saturday morning kids cartoon show, and then one as a movie. You know what I mean? It's the same thing, but it's just.
I feel better about it now. So I have to confess, it's not like I like one style better than the other. It's maybe a very niche concern for me that I feel like that character is never gets life breathed into them, and you've got all these characters that are left behind somewhere. That's more my maybe I'm anthropomorphizing the pieces too much.
My scribbles.
So I feel better now knowing that they're basically like the same spirit but rendered in, you know, like one of them's in anime and Saturday morning and one of them's the grown-up version.
There you go. That's exactly right. Yes.
There you go.
So T-Blam in the chat asked, any favorite Magic the Gathering edition, favorite card illustration from you or from someone else?
Oh, wow. So for those who haven't spent any time or long periods of time in Magic the Gathering, one of the things that's so wonderful about it is that every year they basically find an entirely new, setting, so to speak, for all of the sets that will show up in that year, that cycle, which is, I think, 3. It used to be, it might be more now, but I think it's 3 sets a year. So the artists basically are working within sometimes different styles, oftentimes, most times different IPs or kind of settings, more to speak, within that. I think one of my favorite that I worked on, and keep in mind, I haven't worked actually on a Magic card in over 10 years due to non-competes and things with Hearthstone and otherwise, would have been Lorwyn, which was a really, really fun set because it was kind of it was borderline like high fantasy, but with the Magic the Gathering twist on it. That was really great. I will say I'm terribly sorry to have missed out on the latest one. The God, I'm going to get the name wrong, but it was essentially the anthropomorphized animals that were in their latest set, the Wildborough or Windborough, I think. I forget the name of it, but man, some of the art that's coming out from Justin Gerard and Steve Prescott and all these illustrators that are just like, I'm really sorry I missed that one. So that one feels like one that would have been really great to get to be a part of. I have tons of favorite illustrations from Magic the Gathering over the years, some from friends, some from artists I've always, worshipped or admired from afar. Bloomborough, there it is. Thank you, Ty. Probably one of my favorite illustrators is Mark Zug of Magic the Gathering fame and D&D and a bunch of other things as well. And one of probably my favorite piece from him for Magic the Gathering is Rox the Rhino. So that's been one that's always been a long-standing favorite. I was fortunate enough to be able to get the original for it.
I was going to say, don't you have that hanging on your wall in the living room?
It does indeed. It hangs directly over my reading chair. And it is still a piece that I love dearly, not just for how it was painted, but, just the mastery of the media that he has, and just getting to then later meet him and call him a friend adds to the piece. So it's just it's been a wonderful example of a bunch of things come together.
Yeah, I've seen the Bloomborough cards. A lot of my friends have been sharing them, and they have actually tempted me more than any set recently to kind of get back into collecting. I really, really love them.
I love me a good Wind in the Willows. And that's Wind of the Willows with swords. It's, red wall, everything brought to bear.
Yeah. So Kadane asks again in the chat, have you worked with artists who've only ever drawn digitally? And if so, is their perspective different to physical painters?
Yes and yes. Definitely, the longer I'm in this industry, the more I'm likely, and we are all to be confronted with people who've only ever come into it digitally. It does make for a different approach to artwork, as well as how I communicate, different kind of ideas or thoughts, especially when it comes to just media and things like that, right? You can't use the same words. You don't have the same vocabulary when you're talking to somebody who's purely digital. And an example of that would be, I can't come in and say, well, just glaze, a certain kind of color, we want to change the temperature through a glaze here in a process of that. That's an oil painting term. It's not something that may come immediately to the mind of somebody who's only digital. Or think of painting as we'll start with a grisaille painting, which is basically like a 2-tone or 1-tone type of piece, or one temperature palette piece, where you're basically taking out whites and pushing back darks, usually in a sepia, that you would then paint color over the top of. It's a very Rembrandt method. Grisaille painting, why? Why do that digitally in most cases? And most people won't, and they just start slamming color in. So a lot of that does come down to acquiring a new vocabulary, but kind of approaching it in a way where you're helping them to understand some of the precepts from which their digital media came from, because so much of the digital media, Photoshop does this, Painter back in the day, I know it's not really a tool we use nowadays, but Painter definitely did, very much informed their media based on traditional, kind of in the ubiquitous sense that, why is our save icon still a floppy disk? Why is the trash still a trash can? And it's because it's based on this kind of ideology or iconography of the previous. So kind of coming in and explaining why that brush looks like that, or that's meant to mimic a filbert brush or a flat brush or a pointed brush, and things like that, help you both to kind of form a common vocabulary to talk about those things. So Yes, the approach is different. It means my approach also has to be different. And yeah, I expect to continue to run into artists who are digitally informed and no traditional background whatsoever, which is not a bad thing, just a different thing.
I think there's a lot of artists who maybe who work digitally for the sort of the flexibility, the speed at which you can use. We'll actually go back and do stuff physical for trading cards, because the physical art itself then has more value beyond the the commission. You can sell originals, you can sell prints, you can do all that kind of stuff. And there's some artists I've seen who will go, despite the fact that you're making a little card, will make the original art enormous because it has more value in the real world to collectors that way. So yeah, it's a weird little thing.
I think if Andy Law were here, his background and how he came into gaming art was through cartography, and almost all of them are digital because of the layers, the labels.
Totally.
The client comes back and says, actually, we've moved that location. Actually, we've gone with a different, and there's very few. Maybe Francesca Barrel does them physically, but very few do maps, anything other than digitally now, just because of the unique requirements.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No,
you bring up a good point, in both of you do actually, in terms of like where is the art intended to go? Like, what's its life after whatever that thing may be, or even what's its use purpose? Illustrations, especially Magic the Gathering, D&D, and things like that, still have a strong home in the traditional. For video games, very not a traditional world. Like, it's something that you're going to be doing traditional work for.
Yeah, whenever any studio I worked in as in the video game industry, and I say, oh, I need space for a drawing board at my desk. Can we? I'm like, you want a what? Yeah, I need an actual drawing board because I'm going to be doing stuff with pencils. Oh, okay. All right, we can find a corner for you.
Yeah,
it is a thing.
It's been interesting to me to see. So one of the interns is studying computer arts at Abertay University in Dundee, and she's in her first term, and they've been doing a lot of life drawing, pencil drawing, physical media, and she has come from, well, a background where she's done that at school. Her dad has encouraged her to do both, digital and physical stuff, and given her feedback. But a lot of the young people who are on that course are really surprised. They're like, life drawing? I mean, partially they're like, I have to look at someone's penis, and she's like, whatever. She was showing me her drawings, and she was like, yes, naked guy. Yeah, I drew him. It was really good. Yeah. I mean, it was excellent. And she was like, yeah, you should have seen the rest of the class, Mummy. They were just like horrified.
I mean, so
really
I taught it during my entire tenure as a teacher, which totaled about 5 or 6 years. Life drawing was one of my preeminent classes that I ended up teaching. And yeah, I do think it has value today. It's not something that I would ever cut from a curriculum. And I do think it should be approached traditionally for a multitude of reasons. But yes, I did have a tendency, I will say, to try to cull those attending the class for the correct reasons from those not attending for the correct reasons, through the simple methodology of the very first model on the very first day we had a model was typically almost always the same, we'll say overweight or heavy set older man, to set a standard for, you're not coming in here to draw models in the sense that you are maybe expecting to. It's, and you get a wide variety, and you find your tastes change too, in terms of like what's fun to draw and what's not.
Yeah. Oh God, yeah, those bloody 6-packs, such a pain in the arse to have to draw. No, give me something a little bit more meat on their bones.
The worst is the tattoos, though, Mark.
Oh God.
Yeah, I have to say that first set, the very first day, it was, a heavy set, middle-aged man, but I thought she'd executed it brilliantly.
There
you go.
So I was like, well done, kid.
There you go.
Beauty comes in all shapes and sizes, and actually the art itself has a greater beauty, I felt, than the what was there in life. That sounds a bit harsh, but you know what I mean by that. Right, so over your career, let's talk about you as an artist. How has your personal artistic style evolved, and how has that influenced the projects you've worked on?
That's a great question. It definitely does evolve. It's something that I would say early on, I was extremely detailed and very focused on a lot of the nuance of things, like every chain link, all that kind of stuff was something that I got really excited about. And I would say now, looking back, mired down in and really kind of caught up in too much to my detriment. Stylistically, I have a much more big broad shapes and focuses on broad planes and big shapes, not overly stylized, I don't think, or something that is more childlike or more kind of whimsical in nature, but definitely focusing on broad areas and then how that broad area is rendered. If you think of like a JC Linedecker, I'm much more inspired by him nowadays, whereas if you had said back in early art career, I would have been more focused on the Norman Rockwell and all the little minutia and the details like that. So I'm much more graphical, I guess would be the one word I would say in terms of how I approach my work now, is more graphical as opposed to, detailed in minutia. How has that influenced the projects I've worked on? Well, it was most influential on Hearthstone, since I was the first and only artist of time on that game, and tasked with essentially defining the look and style for the game from the ground up. Still pulling from that book of World of Warcraft and how that world was developed and that IP evolved, and then looking for ways to kind of evolve it again or take it into its next evolution through a lot of stylization. So that game still to this day very much looks familiar in terms of like me, like the kind of artwork that I was just inherently doing and taking part in. And it still feels very, very comfortable in terms of that look and feel. So that was one that I think has most influenced the projects I've worked on. Later games where I would end up being the art director or even creative director, I try to put the focus on whoever the art team is, which is to say, like, who is the lead artist in that group. And typically I've tried to find a lead artist or a group of artists who not only work well together, but create a nice cohesive style of their own. If you've done that job well, I think you do it a disservice to immediately then try to bend it to the will of whoever the art director or creative director is that wants it to go in a very specific direction. And I'm more excited to typically see what that group will find together. Like what is the 2, 3, 4, 5 artists make in terms of an artist and an art style together, and where is that going to take that game? And then your job as an art director or creative director is then to just nudge it and kind of push and prod it till it gets a cohesiveness and a sense of its own look and feel.
And when you say together, are they usually in the same studio, or are your artists usually working remotely from each other?
Well, Hearthstone for sure, we were all in the same studio because that was pre-COVID, pre a lot of those things, and we didn't even have offices in Team 5 on the Hearthstone team. We were all in a very open pit, which I loved, and I'm social enough that I miss it still. In a world that we are more remote now, that has its benefits, it has its detractions. The benefits are obviously you get access to more artists than maybe you would if people, were unwilling to move across a state line or even country to country or whatnot. You still have access to them. You get to work with them. You get to kind of evolve alongside them. That's great. Some of the detractions that have come from it is, I don't know. I think of art as a very social experience. I know it doesn't necessarily always feel that way, especially when so many are freelance and caught up in their own studios or whatnot. But more than likely, those artists are reaching out to their pool of artists and getting feedback and thoughts. Very, very, very rarely is an artist like not talking to anyone as they're doing their thing. And as a result, there is a part of me that's always, wondered in the new, more remote studio setting where you've got 1 or 2 with you and 2 or 3 are remote or whatnot, what art you're missing, which is to say it's a more curated experience. Even as an art director walking around and looking at the art on people's screens, I know they've deleted or thrown away something before I got there, but oftentimes the chance for us to have a conversation over a piece before that happens is much more likely in a studio setting. Yeah. In a remote setting, I'm only seeing what they show me, and I don't get to see the 5 things they threw away to get there. And there might have been some real gems in there that I'm
missing out on that collaborative process before you get to the final thing. I think that's the big downside to the remote culture that we seem to be in more now, for sure. I mean, in terms of artistic style myself, my artistic style has evolved to the point now where I just avoid drawing things I don't like drawing. I'm not very good at. I was watching a Mike Mignola interview recently, and it was sort of I had a road to Damascus moment when he said, "Yeah, I don't like drawing cars, so I don't draw anything with cars. I like drawing graveyards." Hence Hellboy. It's like, oh yeah, just focus on the stuff you enjoy and the stuff you're good at. Don't draw the stuff you don't like. Yeah, it's brilliant.
Yeah, noted. Just give us a list of things we shouldn't write, Mark, just so we know.
As long as we stay in the fantasy, I think we should be fairly secure.
Good. Yeah. So no flying cars, noted.
If we do sci-fi, as long as we can make it gritty sci-fi, nothing too shiny or too clean, I'll be fine.
There you go.
Yeah, Evan Blair Art VODs says, this is such an informative chat. Holy.
Awesome.
Appreciate it.
Holy cards.
Thank you
so much, Evan.
Glad to hear it.
Okay, so of all the projects you've worked on, have we asked this one? Is there a particular piece of art or game? No, we asked about favorite Magic cards. A piece of art or game that holds a special place for you, and why?
Jeez. It might be two different things, which is to say, all the projects I've worked on, I'm going to be
too many.
Beating the same drum, really, which is to say, like, it's hard to not say Hearthstone there because it was so me. It's one of those that I was simultaneously very, very comfortable within, but also push the hardest with, which is to say, to build that consistency, to build that look, to build that style. And as we brought on new artists to kind of help communicate that style and have to speak to it in a way that wasn't just, I don't know, I just did things, and more of a, like, here's why we did things, here's why we didn't, here's the way we approached it. It felt so deliberate and so thoughtful throughout the entire process that it really just felt, I mean, borderline like my kid. It's like, as someone with no kids, like, Hearthstone is the closest thing to a kid in terms of something that came from me.
Yeah, and, for me too, much to my own children.
Much to your real kid's chagrin. And then as far as like a piece of art, I would say, I mean, if you're on my website or have been to the website, in the illustration portion, there's a very long war piece, like military piece. And guess what? There's a lot of influence there from my own geekery. That was informed by, that was actually my graduating piece from art school. So it was the final piece I did as an almost like thesis, if you will, like a senior thesis that was a final piece. And it informed I learned so much with that piece. It's also the biggest piece I've ever painted. You don't get the dimensions on the website. It's 7 feet by 2.5, 3 feet. So it's very big. The frame adds another 1.5 feet. So it was quite the undertaking, and I learned very, very much on it. And I got to work on something that I've never really gotten to again, which is something that really aligns with my military history love and geek side of things.
Also, Zoltan asks, and you've touched a little bit upon this, but to go into it a bit deeper, how do you ensure that the art for a card not only looks visually appealing, but also tells the story or conveys the card's mechanics and theme?
It's a great question, and there's the very, very basic version of it. First off, would be always remember the end up version of your piece is going to be very small, whether that's in a digital game, whether that's in a physical game, especially in a physical game. The end result is going to be about 2.5 inches by 1 inch or so. And as such, big, bold shapes, strong composition, things where you're really focusing on your value breakdown of the piece or your value breakup is going to be first and foremost whether that piece reads at all. Not to say once you get into the details of the storytelling or mechanics, that has to work first and foremost. Once you end up getting into telling a story and conveying the card's mechanics, I would actually flop those two, which is to say, first and foremost, it has to read cleanly and succinctly and immediately, followed by how is the mechanic being demonstrated or shown in the piece. And then if you've done those two things well, the story kind of follows, right? Like the story of what's happening in that scene is because you've been able to demonstrate the mechanic in a clear, concise, succinct way at very small scale. theme is going to be the trappings, right? Like is it fantasy, is it sci-fi, is it all those different things will come through just in the trappings and the way in which all of these things are, robed or dressed, or the environment that they're in, or things like that. But that would be kind of the order that I would go through those.
And how important is it to you to include diversity and representation in the art for collectible card games? And how do you approach this, Zoltanas?
I think it's incredibly important. I would say more so today than it was even thought to be 10 years ago or even 20 years ago, for sure. It's something that I have thought about regularly when doing a piece. If we go as far back as one of the things we haven't mentioned would be the Harry Potter trading card game, which I actually did get to do a number of pieces for, a couple pieces for. One of those, by example, was a Quidditch match. And there was a Quidditch match where they're all in their rooms and there's like 3 characters. And they basically just say, 3 characters, please, here doing these things. And I painted it. I had the sketch and had it all drawn out and basically had it set up as I've got a black girl knocking the Quidditch ball, past an Asian male who's, seen from the back, but you're getting enough of a profile that you were able to see Asian there. And I actually had questions from the group, not negative ones, but like, did the art description say a black girl? And I'm like, no, but it didn't not, right? Like, there's definitely like black kids and Asian kids at Hogwarts. Like, we know this from reading the text. If you read the books, like they come up, and my 48-year-old brain is missing names to attach to these, but I know that they were named and known characters in many cases. And there was kind of okay, it just was something that people hadn't thought about or figured on, which is not to say that, like I or any one specific artist is thinking about it all the time. And that's part of the consideration there. That's part of the question, is there room here to include and also, and should we also be considering, the involvement of other groups into groups that we ourselves may not find ourselves a part of. And what I mean by that is, as artists, we can be very guilty of very quickly of being very focused on our own background and things. And the reason for that, I think, is innocent but true, which is to say, oftentimes I used myself as a model. I know Mark does this all the time for pieces he's doing when you're doing a character. And if you're going to be in a mirror or taking a picture to get a pose or to get anatomy and things like that, it's probably going to be a white male first before it's anything. And to take that extra step to then say, or could it be, and change those things along the way, is one that you should ask, and one that you should assure is always a place in your IP or your world to accommodate.
Yeah, Lindsay's been reminding me that I'm doing a series of pre-generated PC characters at the moment, and Lindsay's reminding me constantly to make sure you get that representation, make sure you get that diversity. And of course, once I start thinking about that, but you're right, I use myself as a model, so it's always this rather sad aging glamster is inevitably my starting point. Like, okay, now let's cast my net a little wider. So it's always a challenge. And also then you once you start thinking about costume and detail and paraphernalia, and when you start to get to broaden your horizons on that, you get to pull in lots of great little ideas from different cultures and things like that you hadn't maybe initially considered. So it's always great for creative breadth as well.
I think you've put it really eloquently there, Ben, when you talked about the people that said, did it say that was a black girl? Because that's the microaggression that people who are not the majority, and that usually in this industry is white men, feel all the time. When I was working on Wifrit 4th edition, there was quotations in each career. And Andy Law had said, right, we want the art to be roughly 50-50, so the quotations should be 2. And we kind of got them back, and they were maybe 90-10. And I just went through and flipped them. And people were uncomfortable with that because they were like, but I didn't write that to be a woman. And I was like, yeah, but nobody asked, so what? Like it almost couldn't be a woman saying it because they hadn't felt somehow it was a woman saying it. And I thought that was a really interesting, and I felt that too, say there's a type of really stereotypical fantasy character, when my mind went, well, that could be a black woman. Yeah, there was a bit of me that felt like, but could it? Yeah, well, of course it could. And I think it's really important that we do challenge ourselves like that, because there's that innocent reason for us
Right.
creating things the way we do, which is we are the people we are who've been creating things and playing in worlds that we've made ourselves for so long that we've, you know, reflected ourselves in them. So I think it's a really, I think to begin with, the onus is on the person giving the brief. If they want diversity, they have to say they want diversity. But if they haven't said it, it doesn't mean that it has to default to a white man.
Yeah. No, and I
And
think that it's a lot of the, so much is in what's not said, so much is in what's not shown, and so much is really up to the creators to do. And I don't think it's the onus is on one group. Like, I don't think it's, in the case of, you know, these art directors or leads on the Harry Potter game, I'm not calling them out as having had the wrong mindedness about it, but rather like they had their mind about it. They had their like-mindedness about it. And it was like, you know, let's do this too. This could be really fun. This creates a sense of, you know, that world that J.K. Rowling was really writing to in a way that felt more real and more like our world as a result of that. I think we're kind of in a weird place too, where we run the risk, I would say, of, you know, as you do include characters of different backgrounds, be they racial, be they gender, be they belief systems, whatever it may be. How do I put it? Like, people are more attuned to it now. They're more attuned to when it gets done, how it gets done, why it gets done, and assigning things to it that you may not have intended or inferred. And it results in things like conversations I've had where it's like, well, I want to put a black woman in this role. Okay, well, we've got to make sure that, you know, that she's not a villain, that she's not this, she's not these other things. And it's like, well, I would like to get to the point where they could be that too. Like, I'm not saying that they shouldn't be now or whatever the case may be, but because it hasn't been shown for so long, being careful how we show them now initially and going forward just needs to be an ongoing conversation about things, so that we're not trapped into a place of like, you know, they can only be one thing. They can only be shown for one reason or only in one role.
Yeah, and I think the key, you're right, is that open conversation. Because most of the time, people are coming from a good place where they want representation, they want to do it well, but it can be quite scary when you're representing something that isn't your background.
Oh, God.
You will do it in a stereotypical way that will inflame and make a situation much worse.
I was, when I was at working on World of Warcraft, and we got the initial pitch to do Mr. Pandaria, and as the concept artist on the team, I said, I know nothing about Chinese culture and myth, and I was really worried that I was going to, you know, put my foot wrong really, really badly. So I went away and read a bunch of books and at least came at it from at least somewhat informed perspective. But there's that nervousness about that.
So I want to get to this question before we finish, because T. Blam would like some coaching.
Oh, God.
I resonated with what you said earlier. I'm still in my overly detailed phase. Ideas on how to progress on simplifying drawing without thinking, and back to my doodle from when I was 7 years old. I have a thought on this that my daughter's been taught at uni, and that is, and she showed me the way they've been taught to do their sketches, and their first sketches are like 5 minutes. So they get told, you need to create this scene, you've got 5 minutes to do it, go. And that's how you get away from, you're not overly detailed, but you're not doodling, you're doing it with purpose, but you time box it. So, you know, I've got to fill this sheet. And she said that she's found that to begin with really scary, but has found it a really, really useful technique. Not only for getting her to away from this overly detailed phase, but for understanding where her technical weaknesses are, what she finds easy and can do quickly, and what takes her longer. So that would be my completely non-artistic background guidance to you.
I think that's a great direction. And I still, to this day, especially in illustrations, use Keith Parkinson's approach, where Keith Parkinson, again, of the four horsemen of the older school TSR work, and one of my artistic heroes, his approach to every illustration he would do would be a gigantic big black Sharpie and nothing smaller. And he would do little boxes, and he'd do almost these kind of Rorschach kind of quick blah, blank lines going this way and a thing going this way, and here's a big mass here, and he'd go on to the next thing, and he'd do pages of these things until he found, I really like the composition of this one, and then take that composition and then go, now start assigning things. This block here is a tree, so that's a tree trunk. This is one of my characters. This piece here across the bottom is like a fallen piece of ship wood, and the kind of the rigging that comes from it. Okay, now I've started to get the scene from it. But he would start with those big, broad shapes that he could not get detailed into because he falls into the same trap, or fell into the same trap of doing a lot of details early on. And this kept him honest. And I thought it was a great approach, and one that I still use today.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that took off about a decade ago was the silhouette approach, where you do a whole sheet of silhouettes. So just black shapes, and you do a whole bunch of them. And then ones that sort of speak to you, you go, okay, I'm going to take that to the next phase. I'm going to start defining what has made this silhouette. Why is that thing spiky? Why is that bit big? Why is that bit small? And then you start to dial into it. So the detail comes later in the process.
Right.
And I would imagine that's a really good technique for something like a small card where it has to be striking, because you're creating that strikingness before you're getting into the detail.
You got it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Interesting. Well, there we go. We've reached the end of our hour. Still loading says awesome episode. Thank you for the information and the encouragement.
Thank you.
Not at all.
Thank you
for watching and popping your questions in. Thanks to Mark for joining me tonight as my fellow Rook, and a massive thank you to Ben for joining us. It's been a pleasure to meet you, to hear about your career. Hopefully we'll get you back on again another time, and you'll become a great friend of the Rookery. So thank you so much, Ben.
Would love to. Thank you so much.
You. As always, thanks to all our patrons for keeping our streams gloriously ad-free, and we will see you next time for another Inside the Rookery. Until then, good night and caw-caw, caw-caw. See you soon.